Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the Charity for Civil Servants, Carers and Care Needs Assessments. My name's Kevin. I'm your host for this morning. Shortly be introducing my colleague, David Jones, to take you through his presentation. First of all, before we do that, just some housekeeping. So if you're joining us online today, welcome. On your screen, you should see a console similar to what we have on the screen now. And throughout the session, we invite you to add your comments, your thoughts, or your questions for David as we go along. You can pop them into the questions box on your screen, and then towards the end of the session, I'll be posing those questions to David, and between us, we'll try and give you as much information as we can. If you're joining us on the phone, again, welcome. You can still interact with us live by emailing webinar@foryoubyou.org.uk. And I'll be monitoring that inbox throughout the session, and again trying to put those questions to David towards the end. So one more time, webinar@foryoubyou.org.uk. Now, David will tell you a little bit more about the charity and the support that we offer later on. But just to say, our vision is a lifelong community of people offering effective support for each other when life takes a turn for the worse. And we do that through a range of different services, specifically our regulated money advice and guidance service, our wellbeing and mental health service, and finally our caring and health service, which of course part of which we'll be talking about today. Originally, we scheduled this to mark Carers' Rights Day, so we're a little bit late, so do forgive us for that, but I'm sure it'll be worthwhile. Dave is going to talk through an awful lot of information this morning. If you want the slides, you can access them from our website, from the same page that you would have registered for today's session, so you can download those and keep them as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand you straight over to David.
Okay, well, thank you, Kevin. Hello, everybody, and welcome. This webinar is an explanatory presentation on local authority assessments, or more precisely, the assessments typically carried out by social services. Before I go into the details of what we'll be covering today, it's probably a good idea to provide you with a little background on myself. My name is David, as you know, and I work for the wellbeing team within the charity. My background is in social services, and before coming to the Charity for Civil Servants, I worked and trained as a social worker for almost a decade. My experiences both in social services and with the charity have made me aware of the fact that avenues of support offered by social services differ from other areas of public service, such as education or health, in that everybody would expect to have contact with education and health, but not everybody would expect to have contact with social services. As a result, this is a service area that is probably least well understood by the general public, and the one that is probably most awkward, even intimidating to make contact with and to ask for help from. A consequence of this is that very few people understand their rights when interacting with local authority social services, or have an understanding of how these supports operate. Everybody knows how to get help from a doctor or hospital. Most people don't know how to ask for help from social services. In the charity's wellbeing service, we regularly encounter people who miss out on supports because they are simply unaware of how local authorities operate or what their entitlements are. For this reason, I've been asked to put together a webinar which can shed some light on this area for people. We will be looking at assessments because, unlike the health service or education, any local authority service can only be provided when there is an assessed need. Because of this, anybody who asks a local authority for help will have to undergo a formal assessment of need at some level. I'll be walking you through three types of assessment: what we would term needs assessments for both adults and children, and carers assessments. While local authorities also carry out numerous other specialist assessment types, these are the three key ones that are required before supports can be offered to the public. Now, while there are a number of differences between these assessment types, there are also a lot of common features. For this reason, I've designed the webinar to focus on several distinct aspects of assessment work, and we'll explain those to you in turn. While there are distinct differences between the children's, adults, and carers assessments, we'll attempt to highlight them as we work through them. Okay. Just to give you an idea of the structure of this presentation, I'll be seeking to cover the following areas, clarifying differences between the three assessment types when necessary, as I do. To start with, we'll be focusing on some general principles that will be useful to understand if you're requesting a children's and adults or a carers assessment. I want to make it clear to you who can ask for each of these assessments and how they can do so. We'll be looking to provide some basic information on the assessment processes themselves, looking at what information is required in an assessment, how social workers or any other professional carrying out that assessment work go about gathering that information, and what kind of questions they'll ask when doing so. I'll also try to explain how decisions are made in assessment work, how it is decided what support, if any, will be offered by a local authority. That can be quite complicated, so bear with me. We'll also look at some of the possible outcomes from the assessment and the services that may be accessed and how they generally work. Finally, at the end, we'll finish off by focusing on some of the supports that the Charity for Civil Services can offer you. Okay, before we get into the core of the webinar, then it's necessary to look at some general concepts about assessment work and identify certain principles or themes that are common to each of the 3 types of assessment that we'll be focusing on. To work through them one by one, the first point of note is to look at regional differences. Basically, depending on where you live in the UK, there will be minor differences in the legislation and practices around assessment. The legislation that dictates social care policies devolves. Because of this, there are small differences between even England and Wales. Northern Ireland and Scotland have even greater separation in the legislation. Now, to be clear, I have little experience of Scottish and Northern Irish laws. As a result of this presentation, we focus primarily on English and Welsh assessment processes. While I'm not seeking to go into the details of legislation in this presentation, this is worth remembering. Beyond this, even within the same country, every local authority will go about their assessments in slightly different ways, and there will be some variations in procedures, terms, and the forms and paperwork that they use between each of these. This can be quite confusing if people move across the country at various times. The next concept to look on is the one of proportionality. One key principle that applies to all assessment work is proportionality. A major reason why many people are reluctant to request help from social services is that because they worry about the process being overly intrusive. This can be the case because professionals completing assessment work will obviously need to ask you personal questions about the specifics of a person's care or indeed a family situation. However, legislation dictates that any assessment must be proportional. This is both to ration resources and to ensure that a family's privacy is not unduly invaded by the state. This means that questions in an assessment should be limited to relevant areas only, rather than exploring every single facet of your personal life. In the same vein, any information gathered in a local authority assessment must be kept confidential. In the same way that medical information held by a GP must be kept confidential. The information can only be shared with individual consent. Likewise, although it is common practice for social services to gather information from other organisations, such as health services or education, when they complete assessment work, this can only be done so with the consent of the individual under scrutiny, or the parents of a child involved if it's a children's assessment. The only time that this can be overridden is when there are safeguarding concerns such as child protection issues. However, there are particular legal thresholds that need to be met before such proceedings can be started. So no worker should ever arbitrarily breach this confidentiality. Consultation. Any assessment completed by a local authority should always be done so in consultation with the person involved, whether it be the child, the adult, or the carer. Where possible and appropriate, it should also ensure that the voices or key family members of that person are represented as well. So every assessment should be conducted in a person-centered way based around the wishes of the individual, and that should always be present within any assessment work. One concept which I'm certainly wanting you guys to come away from and is related to this emphasis on consultation is the fact that if you disagree with the outcome of any assessment, whether it be an adult, a children's, or a carer's, you are well within your rights to challenge it. Many people who complete assessments are frustrated at the level of service that they are offered at the end. However, they often feel that they don't feel empowered necessarily to challenge those outcomes. One thing to be clear is that anybody has the power to challenge any assessment, and that the social worker or whatever professional that's completing it is fallible. They are prone to making mistakes, and they will only do so with very limited information. If you feel that they're wrong, you are perfectly entitled to speak up. The final area that just focus on then is the focus on natural resources and service provision. One point to make clear relates to the outcomes of assessments and service provision. Before they can offer any service, a local authority is required to explore existing resources that are available to a service user via their family, their community, or some other source. Ostensibly, this agenda has been pushed in an attempt to avoid individuals and families becoming dependent on services offered by a local authority. However, if you're more cynical, you'll notice that this emphasis came in during the times of austerity, and is essentially there to ensure that local authorities don't offer services that they don't need to the public, and to save resources. Okay, then when kicking things off properly, then we'll move on to eligibility and specifically look at who can request an assessment. The short answer to this is effectively anybody who can request an assessment from social services. However, not everybody will automatically be offered an assessment after they request it. And of those who are offered it, not everybody will be offered support as a result of that assessment. Each of the 3 assessment types have certain criteria that affect whether the local authority will determine whether it is necessary to carry out that assessment once a request is made. We will look at each in turn, beginning with children's services. Okay. Now, when I noted earlier that people can feel intimidated by the thought of approaching social services, I would suggest that this is particularly the case with children's services. The idea of children's social services is one that makes people quite uncomfortable. It can make them think of horror stories with children being placed into foster care. Most people have no idea what a social worker can and cannot do. For instance, I would imagine that most people do not realize that social workers do not actually have the power to remove children from a family home or to take them into care. This is something only the courts or the police can do. And most people won't know what the limits of a social worker's power are, or indeed what social services can and cannot provide. Because of this, a lot of families who need support and could potentially benefit from it shy away from asking for it. However, legally, anybody can approach children's services and request an assessment for a particular child if you think that child is in need of support. Now, this does not mean that the local authority will necessarily agree to carry out an assessment, and they can refuse to do so if they don't think that the child's needs warrant the provision of support. However, under legislation, local authorities have a duty to safeguard and to promote the welfare of children within their area who are in need, and they have a legal duty to assess any child who appears if they may be in need. In reality, children's services departments deal with 2 types of referrals. Those where somebody is concerned about the welfare of a child due to the risk of abuse or neglect, i.e. cases where there is a risk of a child protection concern. And secondly, those referrals where social services are contacted because the child has a disability or a health condition, or there is some other factor that means that they or their family require additional help, but where there are no concerns about any relating to parenting or abusive parenting at all. Although the assessment tools used for both groups are identical, in practice assessments are quite different. When the first group, social services, are generally contacted with people outside of the families, usually professionals such as health or education, and have to complete an assessment or to investigate concerns raised by these individuals. This leads to social workers having to contact parents out of the blue and start an assessment whether they want it or not. With the second group, they are almost always contacted by the family themselves, who do so to request help or a particular service such as respite to assist them in meeting their child's needs. For this reason, the vast majority of local authority social services departments generally have specialist children with disabilities teams who will deal primarily with families who have approached them for help rather than deal exclusively with situations where they investigate abuse. Okay, eligibility in England. Now, the Children Act 1989 is the most important act in children's law and dictates the duties of local authorities in England in relation to assessing and providing services for children in need or at risk of harm. As you can see from the slides, Section 17 of this Act identifies that local authorities have the responsibility to offer services to any child in need. The only way they can determine this need is to conduct an assessment. Now, I don't want to spend too much time focusing on the specifics of legislation, but it's probably useful to explain what a child in need is at this point. To be clear, this term has nothing to do with the BBC charity of the same name. In this context, being a child in need is actually a legal definition from earlier children's legislation referring to children whose opportunities, health or development could be adversely affected without the provision of services by a local authority. A child could fall into this category for any number of reasons relating to poverty, hardship, or their environment, etc. It's not my intention to go into detail in that respect here. However, it is important to recognise that any child with a disability automatically qualifies as a child in need. As such, it would be highly unusual for a local authority not to offer an assessment to a family with a disabled child who are requesting it. And that's certainly something that I've never come across during my work. Okay, as we said before, there are some regional differences in this respect. So eligibility in Wales is much the same, but there are some slight differences. In Wales, although the Children Act 1989 remains the driving force for children's services assessments, it's been amended by a more recent piece of legislation, the Social Services and Wellbeing Act 2014. As you can see, Section 21 of this Act clarifies more explicit duties in relation to the assessment and identification of children's needs. Local authorities are required to assess whether a child has needs for care support in addition to or instead of the care and support provided by the child's family, and if so, what those needs are. This duty is triggered where it appears to a local authority that a child may need such care and support. A disabled child is presumed to need care and support in addition to or instead of the care and support provided by the child's family. This means that in most cases, a local authority will be obliged to assess the needs of a disabled child. Okay, with adult services, people are probably less intimidated by the prospect of an adult social services assessment than having children's services knocking on their door. However, I found that the average person also has little understanding what adult social services do. Many people view adult social services exclusively as an older people service, so that's something that you might use when you need a care at home or have to move to a care home when you're elderly. In fact, adult social services departments are far more diverse and work with a variety of vulnerable client groups. In most local authorities, you would typically find social services teams set up to support adults with learning disabilities, physical disabilities, mental health issues, drug and alcohol dependence, and older people. As such, anybody who is struggling to manage their independence can request an assessment. From a legal perspective, the eligibility criteria for local authorities has been tightened up by the introduction of the new legislation in England and Wales in 2014. The Care Act 2014 in England and the Social Services and Wellbeing Act 2014 in Wales. Both of these acts specify identical duties which make it clear that they have a responsibility to offer an assessment in a broad array of circumstances. As you can see from the slide, Welsh and English law is identical in this respect. It is mandatory for local authorities to conduct an assessment of anybody who requires or appears to require care and support and to determine what their needs are. This is obviously an incredibly broad criterion. As such, if you feel that you or somebody you care for may require support at that level, then you're entitled to ask for an assessment. Okay, the final category of assessment work is the one that people are generally least familiar with. Although carers assessments have been offered by local authorities for decades, they were often rarely carried out in the past. The introduction of new legislation in 2014 was intended to change this, and carers assessments were given greater prominence in both England and Wales when the various acts were introduced. There are certain distinctions between Welsh and English legislation in relation to carers assessments, although to be honest, these differences are not overly significant. Primarily in England, a distinction is drawn between assessments for carers of adults and an assessment for parent carers of disabled children, with two separate pieces of legislation, the Care Act and the Children and Families Act, dictating duties over these groups respectively. In Wales, all carers assessments are covered by the same piece of legislation. Because of this, the rights of carers of disabled children in England are more specifically defined. Under the Children and Families Act, only a person with a parental responsibility can request a parent carer assessment. So a grandparent who looks after a child part-time would have fewer rights to request an assessment. In Wales, any carer can request an assessment, so whether that's a wider family member or a parent. Now, this is not to say that non-parent carers of disabled children have no right to an assessment in England. It is merely that they're not bound by the updated laws, and as a result, the duties of local authorities to them are slightly decreased. Duties in relation to young carers assessments are also distinct from adult carers assessment under English law. Now, this isn't an area I'm going to cover in detail in this presentation at all. However, it is worth knowing that in Wales, there is no such separation, and carers of these groups are legislated for jointly. As such, young carers have the same rights as to be assessed as adult carers in Wales, whereas in England it's slightly different. Beyond these points, assessments for carers in England and Wales are very similar, and again very broad. Literally anybody who cares for or is even considering caring for somebody needing care can request an assessment. A carer is eligible for an assessment even if they have no current appearance of need for that support. To be clear, this is different for the person that they care for. The person that they care for must have an appearance or a current need to be entitled to an assessment. When an assessment is completed with a carer before there is a need for support, the assessment itself can effectively be used as a tool to prevent, delay, or reduce the likelihood of any need for support in the future, or at least that's the idea. Okay. Okay, moving on then to how to request an assessment. Requesting an assessment from the local authority is much the same in any circumstance. regardless of what variety of assessment you're actually asking for. Every local authority will have what they often term a front door, a team specifically focused on receiving new referrals, prioritising them, and sending them off to the right team for assessment. These sometimes have faintly off-putting names such as multi-agency safeguarding hubs or contact and referral teams, but they will all effectively do the same job. They filter new referrals and allocate them to the appropriate team, the appropriate area of social services. To request an assessment, it will be necessary to make contact with this team either by phone, internet, or email and ask for one. Often there will be separate front door teams for adults and children's services, so make sure that you specify which directorate you need help from when making your inquiry or indeed Google search. It'll be useful to ensure that you can provide certain salient details when you actually put the request for help in. The reasons why you fill in an assessment is needed, for instance, the details of any individual's disability, or a summary of the pressures that you are under, as this will assist in the allocation process. Many people prefer to ask a professional that they are already familiar with, for instance, a doctor, a teacher, or a health visitor to make a referral on their behalf, and this is also entirely acceptable. Applications for carers assessments are usually made via the adult services front door or contact and referral team. However, in some local authorities, social services have agreements with local carer centres to complete this work. In these cases, applications for carers assessments are directed to these organisations instead of the social services team, so it's always worth checking if you're going to ask for a carers assessment. Okay, the assessment process and what it actually involves. So once a referral has been submitted, it is reviewed by the Contact and Assessment Service. On the basis of the information provided, they will then allocate it to the relevant team. The makeup of children's teams in a local authority will vary from area to area. However, all will have specific services set up according to location, need, and disability. In almost all cases, local authorities will have a specific children with disabilities team that focuses on this group. The structure of adult services teams is also subject to some variation. However, most local authorities will have specialist teams for older people, people with mental health issues, people with learning disabilities, and those with physical disabilities. Once a referral has been passed on to a specific team, it will be allocated to a worker to complete the assessment. Although this will generally be a social worker, this isn't always the case. Other professionals other than social workers are allowed to complete assessments, although only social workers will be allocated the more complex cases, so for instance child protection or cases where there's a high risk of harm. This person will contact you then, arrange an introductory visit, and start to gather information. As I noted earlier, the assessment worker cannot contact other agencies without the informed consent of the person being assessed, or in the case of children's assessments, the parent's consent. The only difference to this is in a case where there are child protection issues, in which case an assessment can be conducted and confidentiality can be breached. Usually, though, during their first contact with you, they will request this consent and ask you to sign to say that you're happy for them to approach other agencies. Generally, then, the assessment officer will conduct several meetings and visits with the individual involved, the carers, and any key professionals involved. They do this, and they will begin to gather relevant information on the person's needs. I will go into the specifics of what this is in each of the assessment types in just a moment. When the process is completed, the assessment worker completes an analysis of the information and makes a recommendation around service provision to their team manager or other senior official in the department. And it is then the manager who will make the final decision about whether or not support will be provided and at what level. It's a complex process, and we'll talk more about that later on. Okay, information gathering then with children's services. Now, I don't want to dwell too long on the minutiae of details here, but it's useful to summarise what areas an assessment will cover and what information the assessment officer will ask for. Again, there are some general differences between adults and children's services in this respect, and I'll cover these in turn. However, it's important to stress that again, that there will be some variation in the way assessments are conducted between local authorities, different social work teams, and even between different workers. To begin with, any children's services assessment, whether it's a case that has been referred to social services because a family are asking for support for a disabled child, or one where there's been an allegation of serious abuse, is conducted using the same tools and follows the same structure. This is termed the assessment framework, and it's pictured on the slide. Essentially, information is gathered and eventually analysed according to 3 dimensions, with the assessor looking at the child's development needs, factors such as their health needs, any particular disabilities, what's going on at school for them, behavioural and emotional concerns, etc. Parental capacity. This dimension is particularly focused on during assessments when there are concerns around neglect or abuse. However, even in assessments when there are no suggestions of inappropriate parenting, it is necessary for the assessor to look at how well equipped a parent is to care for their child. For instance, many parents of autistic children find it difficult to adjust their parenting strategies to account for the child's ASD, and an assessment may suggest that they would benefit from accessing additional support without any suggestion that their actual parenting skills are poor. The third area then is family and environmental factors. Any assessment has to take consideration of the environment that the child is growing up in, both the physical environment and the wider family circumstances. So there should be some consideration given to where they live, wider family resources, and wider community resources as well. Now, there was a time when all assessments would demand that each of these sub-areas be specifically addressed exhaustively. This would be time-consuming and intrusive. However, since the law was changed in 2014, there's been a push for what are called proportional assessments. For this reason, only information that is relevant to the assessment will need to be collected. As such, any assessor is unlikely to go through each of these areas in great detail. They should only focus on the areas which are relevant or will become relevant as the assessment is completed. However, one area that is essential for any assessment, whether children's or adults, is to record the express wishes of the individual and indeed their parents or carers. Now, this is explicitly prescribed under legislation with the emphasis on consultation. If you request an assessment for your child and you feel that the assessment worker is not adequately taking your views into account, then you could have strong grounds to complain. Okay, adult services follow a very similar process. However, the fact that they focus on adults necessitates a slightly different emphasis. Similar to children's assessments, there's been a recent change in the manner in which adult services assessments are carried out. 10 years ago, it was common for exhaustive, unified assessments to be completed, which would analyse various subjects in great detail. These have now been abandoned in front of more proportional integrated assessments. However, it is still necessary for any assessing worker to gather information in regard to key respects. I've referenced common areas of inquiry on the current slide. As you'll note, the focus of an adult assessment can be very similar to a children's assessment. Information will need to be gathered on areas such as the individual's background, their health, their emotional and mental well-being, their environment and their existing supports. The primary difference is that in a children's assessment, the expectation is that the focus of the assessment would be reliant on some degree on the care that they receive from their parents or carers. For this reason, the ability of parents to provide care is something that has to be considered. With an adult services assessment, there's clearly not such an expectation. The purpose of the exercise is to examine the person's daily life and establish whether they need support to remain independent or to promote their independence. Adult assessments have certain eligibility criteria, which we'll cover a little later on, which help determine who social services must offer support to. And as such, information gathering should be directed by these to some extent. Again, as with children's services, legislation underlines the necessity for assessments to record the views of the person being assessed and the desired outcomes and their desired outcomes as well. If this doesn't happen in an assessment that you're involved with, then you need to ask why. Okay, finally, carers assessments. I should probably identify at this stage that this is the variety of assessment that I have least experience with. The last one I completed was some years ago. Although carers assessments have existed for many years, local authorities have generally been poor in offering them to people or indeed informing carers about their rights. As such, generic frameworks for conducting assessments have not been developed in the same way as children's and adult services assessments. And as such, there probably tends to be greater variation in the way in which these are carried out. Nevertheless, to conduct a thorough carers assessment, it is necessary to examine a number of areas. These include the carer's physical health and the impact of caring on this, the carer's mental well-being and the impact of caring on this, the financial impact of caring, the carer's wishes around work and caring, the carer's ability to continue caring in the future. These are all areas that should be covered, as well as a thorough exploration of the daily requirements on the carer. Okay. Although the focus of carers assessments can show great variation depending on both who is carrying out the assessment and the circumstances of the person being assessed, there are certain areas which the law specifically directs the assessing officer to cover. Again, in the spirit of consultative practice, it is necessary for the worker to take the carer's desired outcomes, their wishes and feelings into account. These should be a key driver of the assessment questions. However, beyond this, there should also be a focus on the sustainability of a caring role. The assessor should be actively thinking about whether or not this person's in a position where they can carry on caring in the longer term. Carers assessments can serve as an effective accompaniment to a needs assessment of a child or an adult. For instance, when completing the parental capacity dimension of a children's assessment, the carer's needs should be given close consideration at that time. Likewise, when exploring a vulnerable adult situation, it is necessary to determine the demands on the carer and whether their needs can be met. As such, it's becoming more and more common practice for the two to be combined in a needs assessment, with the resulting care plan referencing supports for both the cared for person and the carer. In fact, when completing a carer's assessment, it's good practice to address the various needs that were identified in the main assessment and to detail how the carer can meet these needs. Okay. So when information is collated, any assessment can only be completed when it is properly analysed. The purpose of this analysis will be for the assessor to identify what an individual's needs are, areas where these needs are not being met, and to consider the possible risks should these needs continue to go unmet. Now, the nature of these analyses changes a little depending on whether it's a children's, adults, or carers assessment. This is due to both practical factors. Clearly, an adult assessment will not have to focus on factors such as child development needs, but also due to the fact that concepts such as risk are weighed against different legal criteria as well. Okay, looking at children's services assessments first of all, the purpose of the information gathering portion in the earlier part of the assessment is to specify what the children's needs are, what they're required to develop healthily, and to identify whether there are gaps in this respect. Now, to begin with, it is important to stress that when a social worker considers unmet needs in a children's services assessment, this is not necessarily a criticism of the parent or of the care that the individual is receiving. Sometimes a child's needs may be so significant that no single family could really be expected to meet their needs without specialist support. For instance, a profoundly disabled child might require support that only certain professionals could provide, specialist nurses and treatments. Clearly, it wouldn't be a criticism of the parents, of the child's parents, to point that out. Now, the calculations around unmet needs are both complex and individual to a particular circumstance. Any of the various factors on the assessment framework could be important here. And it's not always possible to predict the outcome of an assessment on the basis of a child's presentation. Now, what I mean by this is that if the families of two children with identical needs were to request respite support, for instance, from a local authority, even if their individual needs were precisely the same, it is possible that differences in parenting circumstances, family or environmental factors could lead to one child being offered a service and the other child not being offered a service. For instance, a common reason why families apply for support from children's services is to request a respite break from caring for a disabled child. It can be very difficult for the parents of disabled children to get a break because of the individual needs of their children, often make getting sitters or temporary carers impractical. Local authorities generally provide such services. However, they need to ration them. In the hypothetical example I cited just before, if one of the families had numerous supportive wider family members and the second did not, it would be more likely that the social services would provide a respite service to the family without the existing natural supports. So this risk analysis should focus on any immediate risks to the child's welfare or well-being. For instance, factors such as issues relating to a health condition, the child's happiness or emotional well-being. Of course, any concerns related to abuse and neglect. However, consideration should also be given to the child's development in the longer term. The assessor should be considering what would likely happen if a particular need continues to go unmet or if a particular service is not provided. The decision-making process around service provision is not the same as with many health or education services, where a particular diagnosis or child development need guarantees a certain level of service. So that's one thing to emphasize. Okay. Moving on to adult services then. In adult services, the decision-making process is broadly the same. However, the nature of the risks under scrutiny is a little different, as are the legal criteria around the provision of services. An assessing worker will still attempt to identify a person's support needs, areas where these needs are unmet, and the possible consequences of what could happen if they continue to be unmet. However, this analysis will focus on the risks to that person's independence and dignity, as well as the risks to their health. Now, critically, this analysis should include a focus on whether the desired outcome identified by the individual being assessed can be achieved or not. So all those factors should be taken into consideration. Now, previously, adult social services were notorious for having different policies around at what level of risk they would offer services from area to area. This was such that an individual might be denied services in one local authority because they'd opted to impose high thresholds before providing the services, but can move and be accepted for services in another local authority simply because their thresholds were lower. It was very much a postcode lottery. And there were suggestions that less scrupulous authorities could impose high thresholds deliberately in order to conserve resources. To address this, the 2014 updated legislation introduced more explicit eligibility criteria within this decision-making process, with the intention to ensure greater uniformity across the country. This is the same in both England and Wales. Local authorities need to consider the same criteria in both countries to determine who is entitled to support. As you can see, there are 3 conditions that must be considered for a person's needs to be considered eligible. Firstly, the local authority must determine whether the person's needs arise from or are related to a physical or mental impairment or illness. So this would cover any physical, mental, sensory, learning or cognitive disability or illness, as well as any substance misuse or brain injury. So it's actually quite a very broad criteria. The second criteria is on the basis of this information, the assessing officer must then consider whether the individual is unable to carry out 2 or more outcomes related to the person's independence, as outlined by particular regulations within that legislation, the list of which is actually shown on the slide here. Now, there's no hierarchy of eligibility outcomes. All of these are equally vital in the decision-making process. When determining whether a person can carry out these tasks, they are considered not to be able to do so in situations where they physically can do a task but experience severe pain or discomfort when doing so, or have to put themselves at risk or take an extended period of time to do so. So, for instance, if somebody could walk down the shops, but a local shop, but it would take them several hours to do so, then under this legislation, there would still be assessors being not able to do so. The third criteria that any assessor must consider is the extent to which these unmet needs impact on the individual's well-being. Again, this is a broad characteristic that can relate to diverse factors ranging from personal dignity, their independence, the ability to maintain personal relationships, physical and mental health, or indeed emotional well-being. Now, it's really important to note that the national eligibility criteria are determine whether a person's or carer's assessed needs are eligible for support from the local authority. They're not about determining whether a particular service is appropriate or even about what the nature of the support that a local authority should or should not provide. Essentially, they make it clear that when a local authority has to do something, they do not specify what it is the local authority has to do. Now, furthermore, as with children's assessments, if there are community services or untapped resources within a person's wider family or community that are available to meet these needs, then it is possible that the person being assessed will simply be encouraged to utilise these rather than have social services offered to put direct support in themselves. However, when an analysis identifies that there are unmet eligible needs, then the local authority is duty bound to ensure that these are met. Okay, as is probably clear from the slide then, moving on to carers assessments, the analysis process for carers assessments is very similar to the one utilised in adult services needs assessments. Again, the information gathered during the initial stages of the process is analysed in an effort to identify what the carer's needs are and any areas where these needs are not being met. Again, this should include at least some focus on whether the carer will be able to achieve the outcomes that they are identifying that they wish to achieve. Likewise, again, these needs have to be scrutinised against a set of eligibility criteria. These vary a very small amount between England and Wales. However, they're not so different that it's necessary to run through the procedures of both countries in detail. As such, I'm going to focus on the English criteria, which are summarised on this slide. Again, there are 3 criteria. The first is that the needs identified must arise out of the care given to an adult. The second criteria is that as a result of caring, there must be a detrimental impact on the carer's physical or mental health or a risk to them, or there must be evidence that the carer is unable to carry out the various key tasks listed here. These include caring for a child, caring for other people, maintaining a habitable environment, eating healthily, developing and maintaining family or other relationships, or indeed simply engaging in recreational activities. Essentially, if as a carer you're struggling to do any of these things, then that's eligibility for a carer's assessment or carer's services. The third criteria is then, as a result of these needs, the assessor must determine that there is or there is likely to be a significant impact on that carer's well-being. Again, as with the eligibility criteria assessment for the eligibility criteria for adults assessments, it is important to remember that these criteria exist to identify when a local authority must take action to address a carer's needs. They do not prescribe what these actions should be. In practice, as with both the other assessment types, local authorities are directed to attempt to meet unmet needs by first exploring resources that are already available to the carer. It is only after these have been explored and exhausted that they will consider the provision of services themselves. Furthermore, as carers assessments are often carried out alongside needs assessments, it is possible that carers' needs will be met via support services which are theoretically being provided for the person cared for. For instance, the provision of day support for an adult with learning disabilities will double up as respite for the carer. Okay, this looks very quickly at the carer's eligibility criteria in Wales. I'm not going to go through this in detail for the sake of avoiding being repetitive and to save time. However, I will point out that the criteria around well-being are largely identical to the English assessment. The third criteria here appeared to cause some confusion with assessing authorities in Wales because the language is somewhat vague, and it could have been argued that any carer could meet their needs with full access to community resources or with large levels of help from the family. My advice would be to anybody asking for a carer's assessment or indeed any assessment at all is to stress what barriers exist that prevent you from accessing community support services. For instance, the financial and practical barriers that mean that it's impossible to do so, and to be realistic about what wider family are prepared to do and not prepared to do to assist you. Any local authority during an assessment will be working under the expectation that families should be providing a lot of these services, and calculating that until those family supports can be ruled out, that they can't provide support. So often wider family can be quite bullish about saying what, and potentially unrealistic about offering support, which, so they can make offers which they can't necessarily follow through on. So it's important for the person requesting the assessment to be realistic about what family can and can't do effectively. Okay, now before we move on, I want to link back to a point I raised at the start of the presentation and re-emphasize that any decision made by a social services department in relation to assessment work is open to challenge. I wanted to underline that the fact that any assessment is massively subjective. I mean, what you may realize already is that assessments are not objective fact printed on page. It's the opinion of the worker who is carrying out the assessment, and indeed the people that they consult with. This may surprise you, but social workers or other assessing officers are not infallible. They make errors all the time. There are multiple stages during assessment where the subjective opinion of the assessing officer can and will impact the outcome, and where there is potential for errors or omissions to skew these outcomes. The social worker will make subjective decisions when they're gathering information, including that could be down to what they choose to include or not include in the assessment, or they will make subjective decisions when analysing risk and identifying needs. They'll make subjective decisions when interpreting legislation. They'll also make subjective decisions when making recommendations at the end of the assessment. Any assessment done properly should be consultative and specifically address the wishes of the individual under scrutiny. So if you disagree with decisions made by the assessing worker at any of these stages, you can challenge the decisions, and you should. It can lead to a more beneficial outcome. To illustrate this kind of via anecdotes, I mean, I spent several years working in a children with disabilities team in one of the poorest areas in South Wales. Now, despite this, I noticed that it was often the case that the children of middle-class families would often get a greater level of support from social services than the children of poorer families, even if the needs of the child were broadly the same. Now, obviously, given what I said earlier, that the community resources and the family resources are taken into account during any assessment, you'd expect that to go the other way. However, what we would find is that middle-class parents would be more prone to make complaints to social services about the outcomes of assessments. They would be more likely to challenge us. They would be more likely to argue about what we said. Because of that, social services often gave in and increased levels of support to those families. this is definitely an area where people who are not confident to argue their case can suffer. So I would certainly encourage anybody, if you disagree with any part of any assessment, whether it be carers, children's or adults, to make your case with the assessing worker. Okay, assessment outcomes. For each of the 3 assessment types, if the assessment analysis identifies any areas of unmet need and these needs cannot be met by the resources already available to the applicant, then the local authority must consider the provision of support. The actual nature of the support can vary, and there are a range of potential outcomes. The first possible outcome from an assessment is that there will be no further action. In fact, it's relatively common for an assessment worker to take a decision that an individual's needs do not warrant the provision of services, or that despite them having particular needs, the assessor may well decide that these needs can be met by the individual accessing services and supports already available to them. As I noted before, social workers are required to consider these existing resources and are directed to do so by legislation. However, remember, you're able to challenge these decisions if you feel that not all information has been gathered or indeed properly considered. A second outcome will be the production of a care plan. The most basic form of support offered by Social Services Department will be via the case being allocated to a social worker and for that professional to produce a care plan. This can sound quite clinical, but in reality, a care plan is really a list of tasks that need to be carried out to ensure that the individual in question is going to be supported. This can outline the provision of specific services, the making of referrals to other services, or specify particular safety plans or actions. Care plans are written in all but the most basic instances where support are provided, so it's a very common thing within social services. Now, every local authority will contract or directly provide numerous different services that can potentially support an individual in need, or indeed their carers or family. Now, these range from services such as carers in the home, respite and short break services, access to community services, the training of parents or carers, the provision of information to them, and indeed many more. However, unlike the NHS or education, this is not uniform across the country. Each local authority in the country will prioritise their spending differently. Some will provide services that others do not. As a result, there is something of a postcode lottery depending on your location and the resources of your local council, and indeed the interests of your local council in this respect. I mentioned direct payments here. This is something that some people may be aware of and some people may not be. I won't go into it in a lot of detail, but often people find that the services that social services provide when there is an assessed need are unsatisfactory to them for practical reasons, or because they have poor experiences with those services. For this reason, whenever a service is put in place by social services to meet a need, legally people have the option to request what they call a direct payment instead. Essentially, this is an arrangement with a local authority, instead of providing you with a direct service, will pay you or provide you with a budget where you can actually locate and fund that service yourself. So, for instance, if the local authority agreed to provide a care service for an older person, but that individual didn't like the particular firm that they were using, they could request a direct payment and engage a carer service that they thought better suited them. Now, there are strict rules in place to prevent fraud in this respect. However, it is relatively simple to set up, and many people utilise this option. A lot of people benefit from the flexibility that it provides. One thing I mentioned here is in regard to refusing services. Now, it's usually unlikely that if somebody who requests an assessment will refuse a service at the end of it. However, it is possible. Indeed, some people may change their mind about going through with an assessment midway and ask for them to be stopped. In the vast majority of circumstances, assessments are conducted purely with the consent of the individual involved or the family. As such, if they decide at any point that they don't want help from the local authority, they can end the involvement. So whether that's partway through the assessment or after the assessment. Now, this is complicated to some extent when there are safeguarding concerns or there is a risk of abuse, and this is an area where there are significant differences between children's and adult services. Basically, if safeguarding issues are suggested in a children's services assessment and parents opt not to accept or engage with social services supports, then that can potentially lead to child protection investigations. The local authority has a duty to protect a child which overrides the wishes of the parents or even the child's expressed views. So in situations where a child may be at risk of what is legally termed significant harm, the local authority has to complete assessment work. Furthermore, in a situation like that, a parent's refusal to accept or engage with social services can be looked upon very negatively. In adult services assessments, things are quite different. Even if there is a safeguarding concern about a vulnerable person, that individual still has the power to refuse services or stop an assessment without consequence, as long as they have the mental capacity to make that decision. Now, the final area I want to note upon here is in relation to financial contributions. Again, this is an area where there's a significant difference between children's and adult services. Children's services are effectively free. If somebody's assessed to need a service, then it will be provided without the expectation of any financial contribution from the family. With adult services, it's different. Service provisions can include charges depending on the financial resources available to that service user. Essentially, before any supports can be put in place, adult services are required to complete financial assessments. They generally do this at the same time as they do the needs assessment. But essentially, if people have significant savings, then they are expected to contribute towards the cost of any social services. As people may be aware as well, there are specific upper limits, etc. I mean, this relates to people having to sell houses, etc., or before they to fund their care as older people. I won't go into it in any more detail than that, but it's important to know the difference in principles. Now, potentially carers services can also be subject to a financial assessment in this way. However, in practice, local authorities don't generally insist on this. I mean, the fact is that unpaid carers save local authorities millions, in fact, billions of pounds every year by carrying out tasks that they would otherwise have to fund. As such, it would seem rather churlish to charge them for support services. The worst case scenario for a social services department would be for a carer who's requesting an assessment to actually turn around and say, I can no longer continue to care for this person because the cost implication of that to a local authority is far greater than any service that they may be asked to provide. Okay, what I've done here is provided a list of different types of support services that local authorities can potentially provide. I'm not going to go through them in great detail. Again, just to emphasize that this list is not exhaustive. There are services beyond this potentially that a local authority could provide. There's always a push for local authorities to be more creative and not just rely on a particular set of services and supports. So this is something that should be explored at the end of any assessment, really. Okay, now I've given you a kind of a basic overview of local authority assessments, and I hope you now have a better idea of how these work, how you can request one, and what supports they can lead to. However, I realize this is an area that can be very complex, and I should stress that nobody would be expected to fully understand the intricacies of social services assessments after a single webinar. For this reason, I wanted to conclude this presentation by identifying that there are various services that can assist you in liaising with your local authority to request support, and indeed in making sense of all of this. Now, nationally, there are numerous disability and carers organisations that commonly advise people on their rights and give practical directions in this regard. Locally, there will be advocacy support services and independent organisations such as carer centres close to you that can also offer direct help. Now, these vary from area to area depending on what local provisions exist and what national organisations have a presence close to you. However, in every local authority, there will be carer centres and carer-focused support organisations that can assist you in approaching social services. Likewise, you would also find specialist disability organisations such as MENCAP, SCOPE, the National Autistic Society, or organisations that support various health conditions such as the British Heart Foundation, the Alzheimer's Society, and many more that possess expertise in these particular areas. In most organisations, there would also, in most local authorities, there will also be advocacy services locally which can support children or vulnerable adults in making their case to social services too. Okay. Of course, one source of support that is only available to current or formal civil servants is the Charity for Civil Services. We provide an array of support services and supports to people that can assist you in managing care and responsibilities or in dealing with your local authority. Now, at the risk of blowing our own trumpet, I wanted to run through a few of these before we finish. Now, the first one on the list here is carer statements. The carer statements that we offer alongside our carers passports are specifically designed to enable efficient information sharing with agencies such as social services. Now, this can be a great assistance to people going about requesting an assessment of any type, as they can clearly outline care and responsibilities and the pressures on individuals in a format that's designed to be shared with an assessing professional. Whenever anybody requests a carer statement or passport from the charity, we will also provide information on other services that can help them. This can include signposting them to local services that can assist them in dealing with social services. Now, the charity runs a wellbeing service that can provide advice, direction, and even direct support to people in a wide variety of situations. This can range from people struggling to deal with mental health issues to people struggling to manage the pressures of caring to those seeking additional help with a specific issue. Applicants to the service are able to directly talk to wellbeing officers such as myself, who can offer advice about how to liaise with the local authority, amongst many other things. The charity is also able to provide financial support or in some circumstances assist people to pay for expenses linked to their health and well-being. For instance, the wellbeing service is sometimes able to assist people in paying for physical or psychological therapy, and the grants team are sometimes able to assist with funding applications at home or in providing practical support in other ways. Now, while the charity has certain eligibility criteria in these respects, it helps hundreds of people in this way every year. And if you're struggling in one of these respects, it could be an avenue of assistance available to you. Finally, there are a number of digital tools and resources to assist people in managing their care needs and their well-being on our website. To finish things off, I'll run very quickly through the carers digital resource offered by the charity and provide a little more detail. This was launched in June of this year and developed in partnership with Carers UK. The Carers digital resource is packed full of information, guides and tools which help people manage their caring responsibilities. It covers areas such as health, nutrition, well-being, short breaks, carers' rights, etc. And the resource is there for people to access anytime, anywhere, and it is of course free of charge. I can't run through every area covered by the resource here and now because we don't have the time. However, to summarize some of the key elements, it can provide access to a range of e-learning courses, guides and downloads, including topics such as your health and well-being, assistive technology and young carers. An element of it is the upfront guide, a unique self-assessment tool that gives you personalized advice and information. It also allows access to the Carers UK online forum, which gives you the chance to interact with other like-minded carers, which is a great source of peer support and can allow you to draw on the pooled experiences of hundreds or even thousands of other carers. It also offers access to the Jointly smartphone app, which is a free to download tool to help people manage shared caring responsibilities. Normally there would be a charge to access this, but via the Carers digital resources that we offer is free. If you want to apply or access the Carers digital resources, you can complete a short online form on our website. If you just go to our services, access our digital services, and tick the box for the Carers digital resource. You'll be asked a few details about yourself and your workplace to establish eligibility. You'll also be asked if you want to keep in touch and how you would prefer to be contacted. If you complete that section, we will be able to keep you up to date about service developments and the work of the charity in the future. Once you've submitted the form, you'll be sent an email with a link to the Carers digital resource and an access code. Please go to the link and create an account. And once you've done this, you'll be able to access the resource freely. The access code will also entitle the user to download the Jointly app, again, completely free. Okay, well, that's just about winds things up for me. Thanks for listening. I hope I didn't put you all to sleep. I hope this has been useful for you.
Wow, David, there's an awful lot of detail there, and I'd urge anyone who's listening with an interest to visit our website, and you can download the slides and you can refer to them later on. It's an awful lot to cram into an hour, so I think you've done rather well to go as far as you had. There's a couple of kind of quick questions and comments which I'll just share with you before we log off. The first one is, I've had an LA assessment, a local authority assessment, which suggested I would benefit from a number of different things. However, they said that they couldn't provide any of them. So it seemed like a waste of time and quite a stressful experience. I think that's perhaps sadly not uncommon, but there might be other places that could provide that support, possibly.
Yes, I mean, first and foremost, I mean, what any social worker should have is access to a wealth of information resources, and they should have an idea about what services are available in your local area. I mean, they may not have an exhaustive knowledge of this, but they should certainly be able to put you in touch with whether it's a specialist organisation or a carers organisation or whatever else. In regards to the assessment itself, I mean, essentially, if a need has been assessed, then there is a duty on the local authority to ensure that that need is met. Often though, I mean, often local authorities will fudge this to some extent when they're completing the assessment. So it may be identified that somebody might benefit from X, Y, and Z rather than saying that they need X, Y, or Z services. So if you feel that, you know, like I say, feel that you can challenge the outcome of that assessment. I mean, it can be dispiriting if you go through the rigmarole of going through an entire assessment and then nothing comes out of it. But like I say, you know, you can challenge the outcome of it. People who complain about these things are more likely to get support than people who do not.
And I guess it's probably worth saying in relation to carers assessments, I know that the charity can sometimes provide support for those things. So if you've had a carers assessment and the whatever's been recommended, like I think you said, killers in the detail, really it's about what you benefit from rather than necessarily are entitled to. But it might be that applying to the charity and saying, you know, providing that carers assessment with details, it might be something the charity can help with as well. Final one before we log off, because I'm conscious of time. A colleague of mine is clearly a carer for his elderly parent who is in a care home but doesn't see it like this or identify as a carer. Any advice on how to approach this with him and what to suggest that could help him? So yeah, this is something I've seen before actually, where you know someone's clearly a carer but they just don't identify in that way.
I mean, it's difficult because it links back to what I was mentioning before. Any adult has the ability to refuse support, and under legislation, people have the right to make bad decisions. I mean, a lot of people who are carers don't recognise that they are carers. I think it may be a good idea to go on. If you can look at some of our other webinars online. So we do one in relation specifically focusing on carers and carer supports that the charity offers, which actually includes quite a lot of detail on specifically looking at what a legal definition of a carer is. So directing them to that, or certainly having a look at that before you approach them, and I guess getting your own knowledge up to speed may be a way of convincing them. But effectively, I mean, you can't force someone to accept care. I mean, it's care or support, unfortunately, from a local authority, or to request, or to go to them and request an assessment.
Okay, there were a couple of others, and what we'll do is we'll go back directly to the individuals with a response on those. So unfortunately, we've run out of time. David, thank you so much for going through all of that and sharing all of that information. As I said, you'll find the slides online to download. We'll also be posting the recording of this session on our website, hopefully by the end of the day. So if anyone wants to share it with colleagues or listen again, then it will be available to do so. Just on the screen, do stay in touch with the charity. You can complete a form to keep in touch, or you can join our social media channels. And if anyone wants to talk to one of our advisors about what help the charity can support as well, our free phone number 0800 056 2424. Thanks once again, and have a great weekend, everyone.